Thank you very much, Paul, for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me to come to this meeting. I must say the lunch was absolutely delicious, and I certainly enjoyed it. What I'm going to be talking about today is as Paul said, an update of the report that I wrote 12, 13 years ago on the costs of hearing loss in Europe. So what I'm going to do is give you a bit of background to the report and talk a bit about what it's going to cover, what the current report is going to cover. And then I'm going to give you some sort of snapshots of some of the results of the review that I've done so far. Basically, what the report consists of is a big literature review of work that's been published in the last, well, since I did the review, which was published in 2006. So really stuff that's been published in the last 12 years on the same sorts of topics. And then, as I said, I'll just give you a sort of snapshot of some of the conclusions from some of the evidence that's been published since then. What I'm going to cover is the health impacts of hearing loss, the prevalence of hearing loss in Europe and the UK and Ireland in particular. And then I'm going to finish up with giving you some preliminary figures from my calculations of the costs of hearing loss in Europe. So some background, I published, or BIHIMA published the original report, BIHIMA and Hear It in 2006, published the original report. And then they came back to me in 2015, so 2.5 years ago, and said, would I be interested? And in fact, they actually approached a colleague who, when I did the original report, I was still working at London South Bank University. And the work came through a colleague of mine there who is now at Brunel University. I've now retired from South Bank, so I'm an emerita professor at South Bank. And for this particular project, I was a visiting professor at Brunel, so the work has been done through Brunel University. And they approached my colleague Mark Atherton at Brunel, and he got in touch with me and said, how about it, would I like to do an update? And I said yes. It was supposed to be completed a year ago, but I'm hoping it's going to be completed this summer, and you'll see some of the reasons why it's taking so long to do. And these are some of the reasons. The main reason is that there has been so much published in the last 12 years. There's been more material published in the last 12 years than there had been in the previous 2,000 years, probably 20 times as much, I guess. Huge numbers of papers published on the general topic of hearing loss and its impact and use of hearing aids and so on. So it's just taking a very long time to go through all that material and to try and draw it all together and make some sensible conclusions from it all. And one of the difficulties is that all the different papers use different methods. They use different types of subjects in terms of age, in terms of how hearing impaired they are, use different definitions of hearing loss, and different ways in which hearing loss is assessed. And one of the particular things, which I've actually written about in the new report, is differences between self-reported hearing loss and audiometrically measured hearing loss. And there have been quite a lot of papers written on that, comparing that. And partly because of all those differences between the studies, you get lots of different conclusions from the different studies. And then another of the, well, it's not really a problem, and I'll show you in a moment, but there are different definitions of hearing loss. What is meant by mild hearing loss, and we'll have a look and see, it's defined differently by different organisations. And how do you define Europe? I'm not confining, I am categorising Europe into the EU, 28 countries in the EU, so thank goodness I'm doing it this year and not next year, and though we do hope, but anyway. So one simple way is categorizing it as far as the EU is concerned. But organizations like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, define Europe differently. They include different countries in Europe. So even that is complicated. Some of the main differences that I've noticed between 2006 and now, one good thing and a good source of information is that there have been many, many studies on aging, particularly in the Western world. There's such concern about the implications of the aging population. So there have been many sort of longitudinal studies going back, maybe some of them going back sort of 25 or 30 years, but following populations as they age. And lots of people have taken data from those studies, data related to hearing from those studies, and made a study of the impact of hearing on things like dementia, other diseases, etc., etc. And I'm sure the same is true of all the other diseases and health conditions that are covered in those studies. Then, of course, there are the Eurotrack surveys, which started after I'd done the previous report, and also the World Health Organization Global Burden of Disease surveys, which are carried out every year and look at the prevalence of about 300 diseases around the world. So they all provide, a huge amount of data, as we saw this morning on the Eurotrack studies. But the main differences as far as sort of effects are concerned are, and this was mentioned this morning, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it again later on, the links between hearing loss and dementia and general sort of cognitive decline. In 2006, it had been sort of looked at in one or two studies, but the results were very inconclusive and reasons were given as to why there might appear to be an association between hearing loss and dementia. But as we saw this morning, and you'll be seeing that same wiggly diagram again later on in my presentation, there's more conclusive evidence now that seems to show there is definitely a link between hearing loss and dementia, and also a huge number of papers on that particular area. So that's one of the big sort of noticeable differences. And the other thing, as was mentioned this morning, I think, that stigma seems to be much less of an issue. It's not mentioned nearly as often as it was in the papers that I reviewed previously. And I just want to tell you a little anecdote. I've got a friend who's been wearing hearing aids for about 3 or 4 years, and she teaches music therapy in special schools. She lives in Yorkshire, and that will be relevant if I get on to a second anecdote about her, if I have time at the end. She dresses quite flamboyantly. She wears bright colours and things. And she has got, I can't remember what make they are, but you might know, because she's got bright red hearing aids. She wanted hearing aids that people could see, both other people and the children who she teaches could see as well. And she was wearing these. She came to my birthday party exactly a year ago, and she was wearing her red hearing aids, and I've got other friends who wear hearing aids, and they were so impressed by these, and everybody I know now wants red hearing aids. So I think the days of making hearing aids invisible, might hopefully be over, and I would like to see, and certainly when I think I'm going to have them fairly soon, and I would quite like ones that are noticeable, in the same way as I wear bright green glasses. I'd like to have coloured hearing aids, so that's just something to think about. Right, getting back to the study. This is just an example. I said there have been lots of studies of ageing, so this is just to illustrate that, and you can see that in Europe, Australia, USA, they've all carried out these long studies of ageing, which have provided all this data, which has subsequently been analysed. Now, what the report is going to cover, basically the same as the 2006 report, but with a few additions. So, definitions of hearing loss, prevalence in Europe, and Europe is, the EU is sort of bigger than it was in 2006. As I said, there's a chapter on self-reporting compared with audiometry. Then various effects, psychosocial, impacts on health, relationship with dementia. impact of hearing loss on employment and earnings, chapters on the ownership, use and benefits of hearing aids, and then other studies of the costs of hearing loss, and then my own calculations of the costs of hearing loss. I'm not going to cover today, I'm going to give you, as I say, some snapshots of most of those topics, but I'm not going to cover the one that is actually probably of most interest to you, so apologies for that, the one on hearing aids, because I know that's been covered by the Eurotrack talk and workshops. So just, I don't know if you can see that, but this is just examples of different definitions of hearing loss. And so, for example, mild hearing loss might mean 26 to 40 dB, 20 to 34, or 25 to 40. You've got different categories and then different definitions within those categories. So you always need to sort of be careful and have a look when people are talking about mild hearing loss or whatever, about what exactly they mean. This is, just shows you from the Global Burden of Disease, the most recent data, the prevalence of hearing loss. This is in the 28 countries of the EU. The average, sorry, it's not the average, it's the total prevalence. So it occurred to me when I was reading this through this morning, looking at my printout, that it would be more sensible to start at 35 dB, and then you could actually have made some sense of the severe, profound and complete categories, but anyway, never mind. It just shows you the general sort of pattern of hearing loss. And then in the UK, you can see you've got a very similar pattern, and the same in Ireland. In Ireland, actually, you've got a slightly, I should have put them both on the same slide, slightly different relationship between the mild category and the moderate category. A relatively bigger difference in Ireland compared with the UK. And as we heard this morning, prevalence of hearing loss in Europe is increasing. And there are various reasons for that. The sort of overwhelming reason is the increase in life expectancy. It's increasing throughout the world. This is a World Health Organization publication, due to increase in life expectancy plus various other things, medication, disease, and so on. And then Adrian Davis in 2009 estimated the European prevalence to be 1 in 6, and it's going to increase to 1 in 4 by 2050. And Action on Hearing Loss have provided similar predictions, 1 in 6 in 2011, and it's going to increase to about 1 in 5 in 2030. Back in 2006, the general figure taken then was 1 in 7. This is an average of the Eurotrack data for 10 countries, well, not the most recent surveys, because it's not the most recent UK one that we saw this morning, but the average showing the prevalence of hearing loss related to age. So you can see how you've got an increasing curve. And in fact, if audiometry was carried out, the curve would actually probably be much steeper, because it appears that younger people overestimate their hearing loss and older people underestimate it. So you'd have higher bars at the top end and lower bars this end. So you'd have a steeper curve, but a bigger difference between younger and older hearing loss. And if we have a look at the how the age profile is changing, this is based on United Nations predictions for the European countries. And the blue bars on the left are 2020. So if you look at the blue bars, you can see that the majority of the population are age 60 and below. And then if you look at the grey bars, which are 2050, you can see that it more or less levels off up to the age of 60. And then there's actually a slight increase in the 60 plus, 70 plus age groups. So, in other words, a much bigger percentage of the population are 60 and above than at the present time. So when you think of that pattern and the increasing population, that explains why the prevalence is going to increase over the next 20 or 30 years. And just for comparison, those are the same, the UN data for the UK and for Ireland, and again showing a similar pattern, the population over 60 increasing relative to the younger population over the next 20 and 30 years. Now, coming on to the impacts of hearing loss, these are some of the areas that there's been sort of quite a lot of material published in the last few years. The size of the blobs more or less represents the relative number of publications in the different areas. So you can see there's been a lot published on depression, the relationship between hearing loss and depression, again, as we heard this morning. In fact, quite a lot of what I'm going to say you've already heard this morning. Links between hearing loss and loneliness. Again, we heard about that this morning. And the impact of hearing loss on family and personal relationships. So it has those impacts. And of course, depression and loneliness are known to reduce overall quality of life. And also loneliness in particular has been shown to increase the risk of an early death. There was something published, just in the last sort of 3 or 4 weeks. I think it was the report of the Joe Cox Commission on loneliness, which found that there was a link between loneliness and early death. There was quite a lot on the news and in the media about it. And I think there was another survey published as well at around the same time. So, hearing loss has an indirect impact on, possible increased risk of an early death. In terms of physical health, it's been shown to have impacts in these areas. We heard this morning about the latest report by Amiva in France, who's looked at the impact of hearing loss on activities of daily living. And that's something quite a lot of the aging reports the aging surveys have looked at. The activities of daily living are things like getting dressed, going shopping, sort of day-to-day activities, and having any sort of impairment in any of those is a recognised measure of general disability. So there's been quite a lot showing that hearing loss leads to problems with the activities of daily living. Comorbidity, I'll come on to that again in a minute, that people with hearing loss tend to have various other diseases, a greater likelihood of having various other diseases. Mortality we've already mentioned in terms of depression and loneliness. There have been several studies which have looked at the relationship between the number of falls that people have and hearing loss, and having a slower gait as well. Having a slow gait is also an indication of serious ill health, and there's sort of conclusive evidence showing that people with hearing loss have a greater number of falls and a slower gait than people who are not hearing impaired. And then again, several studies, many studies in fact, showing that it has an impact on overall health-related quality of life. And various studies have shown that it has a greater impact than other diseases, such as diabetes, hypertension, angina, sciatica, heart failure. So it does have a very, very significant impact on overall physical health. Just those two blobs at the bottom, an area where there's been several papers, but the results really are inconclusive. Relationship between hearing loss and cardiovascular health and strokes. And some papers show there is a link, other papers show there isn't. So as yet, I think the evidence there is inconclusive. You can't say that, yes, hearing loss definitely has an impact on those areas. Looking at comorbidity and the relationship between hearing loss and having other diseases, and these are some of the diseases that have been shown to be linked to hearing loss, or shown that people with hearing loss have a greater incidence of these other diseases: cancer, high blood pressure, emphysema, diabetes, arthritis, dizziness. Now, that's not to say that hearing loss causes those diseases. It's to say that there is a sort of proven association between hearing loss and these other diseases, but people don't actually understand what exactly the relationship is. It just appears that there is a relationship between them, even when the data are corrected for things like age and other factors that might affect the relationship. Now, just coming on to dementia, which we heard about this morning, up to now, it's been very difficult to look at the results and draw any conclusions, because studies were so different and came to different conclusions that you couldn't say, oh yes, there's definitely a link between association and loss of cognitive ability. And it's the reasons I gave at the beginning. People have used different study populations. There have been different types of study, different types of cognitive tests. Some people just use one very short test. Other studies have used much longer, whole battery of tests. It used to be thought that one reason why a link was shown between cognitive decline and hearing loss was because in the early studies, the cognitive tests were presented verbally. So if somebody was hearing impaired, they just might not have heard the questions. But in fact, since then, other people have compared the results if they test verbally or non-verbally, and there doesn't seem to be that much difference between the results. The type of hearing assessment, as I said, which is a constant sort of thing that you need to keep in mind, whether it's hearing loss is self-assessed or whether it's actually measured audiometrically. And also there are several symptoms common to both hearing loss and dementia. Lack of comprehension, difficulty following conversation, and so on. So that sort of muddied the relationship a bit. However, sorry, I'm not sure what's happened there. We'll ignore that first bit where it says overall results contradictory. It is generally agreed that the relationship between hearing loss and cognition is complex, and nobody really quite understands exactly what the relationship is. If there is an association, what causes it. They think that it's maybe the same part of the brain that actually is responsible for things to do with hearing and things to do with cognition. But there has been some work that's shown that an increase in hearing loss is associated with greater cognitive decline. So the greater the hearing loss, the greater the cognitive decline. But several of the studies, once they corrected for various other factors that would affect both hearing loss and cognition, dementia, then they found that the association between the two disappeared. But we heard about the Lancet Commission this morning, which was published in the Lancet in the autumn, a few months ago. And that's freely available. You can look it up in the Lancet the paper is by Livingston and many other people. And as we heard this morning, it was a review that looked at all the data and published evidence on causes of dementia. And they found that 35% of dementia cases could be attributed to a combination of 9 modifiable factors. And you saw this diagram this morning. Basically what this is, I know you can't read it, but the top of it is birth, and the bottom of it is death, and that shows life's pattern, and hearing loss is within the green blob in middle life, the green blob on the right. And this lists the 9 modifiable risk factors, and you can see there that hearing loss is the greatest contributor to that 35%. So hearing loss is 9% of the risk of dementia, hearing loss in middle age. So what that means is that if hearing loss in middle age was managed, it could potentially eliminate 9% of cases of dementia in later age. So that, of course, has enormous implications for social care, quality of life, social costs, health costs, etc., etc., etc. So that's a sort of good news for you in a way. I mean, it's, as was said this morning, you know, it provides a great sort of motivation to actually do something about hearing loss, treat hearing loss in middle age. Now, the impact of hearing loss at work. Again, there's been some studies, not a huge number of studies, but various, these are just sort of various things that people report in connection with their work if they're hearing impaired. It does look as if people have a lower income, people who are hearing impaired, lower socioeconomic status, they tend to retire early, and they might be unemployed or underemployed, doing lower status work than they are really qualified for. And if you look at the studies and sort of take an average, it looks as if the earnings of hearing impaired people are about 75% of those of non-hearing impaired people. And the employment rate of hearing impaired people is around about 83% of the general population. There aren't that many studies on that area, but I think those figures are slightly higher than they were back in 2006. So, if I come on to the costs of hearing loss, there have been several studies into the costs. So, France, the World Health Organization, lots of bodies have looked at the costs of adult hearing loss. Again, often part of the general sort of concern about an aging population. And the costs that are being considered in most of them are the healthcare costs associated with diagnosing and treating hearing loss, costs of reduced quality of life, and costs of lost productivity. Now, the only two that I've looked at are those, because there are such different sort of financial models for providing hearing aids in all the different countries of Europe that I couldn't actually calculate the first bit on a Europe-wide basis. So those are the two things I've looked at. So I'll just quickly go through and show you how I've calculated those two aspects and the figures that I've come up with. So to calculate the reduced quality of life, I used the method similar to the method that I used in 2006, which has since been used by other people in other studies. And it's based on the Health Utility Index, which is basically a number between 0 and 1, 1 being perfect health and 0 being dead, basically. So you can assign, for any disease, you can assign a number between 0 and 1, which reflects the sort of impact of that disease on your quality of life. It's used a lot in cochlear implant studies, actually, to look at the cost effectiveness of cochlear implants. So what I've done is I've assigned values of the Health Utility Index to different grades of hearing loss, and then you can see it's normally for a sort of normal healthy adult, it's taken to be, with normal hearing, it would be 0.85 is the average. And then from that you can work out how many years of reduced quality of life are attributable to hearing loss, and from that you can work out a cost. So just to show you, in 2006, I just had the categories mild, moderate and severe hearing loss with associated HUI values. But this time, because I was using the data from the Global Burden of Disease studies, I've assigned a health utility index to each of the 5 categories of hearing loss in those studies. And that's, I haven't just sort of completely made the numbers up, it's based on the reviews that I've done of the quality of life and other studies on which have used the health utility index. As I said, several of them are cochlear implant studies. And doing that, these are the costs. This is for hearing loss greater than 25 decibels. I've also got figures for hearing loss greater than 35 decibels or greater than 20 decibels, so on, but the ones I'm showing you here are for hearing loss greater than 25. And I should say these are estimated provisional figures. If you assume that everybody with hearing loss is unaided, then it's 299 billion euros for the EU, 37.5 for the UK, and 3.7 for Ireland. And I've also worked it out using the Eurotrack data on how many people in the different categories of hearing loss have hearing aids. And that brings it down to 200 for the EU, 25 for the UK, 2.5 for Ireland. Then for calculating loss productivity, I've calculated, again using global burden of disease studies, the prevalence of hearing loss for working age population. Then I found for every country the employment rate of working age people, and then assumed, and again, this is very much a sort of an average, guesstimate, assumed that in every country the employment rate of people who are hearing impaired will be 83% of that of the general population. And then using those figures you can calculate, and this method was used in the Commission on Hearing Loss report that was published in this country in 2014. Then you can calculate the number of people who are lost to the labour force because they're hearing impaired, and then from that you can apply economic output per person and come up with a number. So again, for the EU and for hearing loss greater than 25 decibels, I calculated that to be 293 billion euros for the EU, 33 for the UK, 4.6 for Ireland. So adding together those numbers, which is a bit iffy adding them together because it's not quite like adding apples and pears. It's like adding eating apples and cooking apples. You're not really adding exactly the same thing. But if you do add up the total costs, then it comes to almost 500 billion euros for the EU, 58 for the UK, 7 for Ireland. And that's taking that figure for quality of life, which assumes the current rate of ownership of hearing aids. And those costs will be underestimated because, first of all, it assumes that all the hearing aids that are provided are actually worn, which we know from Eurotrack surveys isn't the case. And there are other costs that aren't included. As I said, I haven't included healthcare costs. There'll be lower taxes, lost taxes because of lower income. It doesn't take account of any welfare payments due to unemployment, and it doesn't take account of all the healthcare costs associated with all the diseases and problems associated with hearing loss. So conclusions are that prevalence of hearing loss is increasing. We've seen that hearing loss affects many aspects of life, mental and physical health, quality of life, employment and earnings. Hearing loss in middle age is a high risk factor for dementia, and the sort of hidden costs of adult hearing loss in Europe exceed 500 billion euros. Now, if I've got time, I would just like to tell you the final story about my friend Judith and her red hearing aids, which you'll be pleased to hear. As I said, she lives in Yorkshire. She was in London about 3 weeks ago and told me she'd lost a hearing aid and she was sort of struggling with one hearing aid. I was in Yorkshire last weekend and I met up with her, and she'd spent the morning, Saturday morning, emptying. She had big dustbins outside her front door and she'd been emptying them which she grew plants in, emptying them ready to put new plants in. And she said, guess what? She said, this morning I tipped up this bin and out came all these dead leaves, tipped it onto a pile of other dead leaves, and there was my hearing aid. And so she said, I picked it up, washed it, put it in, and it works perfectly. So her hearing aid, not only is it red, but it survived about a month in a dustbin covered in soil and everything. So just thought you'd like to know that. Okay, that's it. Thank you.